Hello everybody, it's me, Fiki, or Fiona Timms, author of White Zulu, Zulu Mists, and now Book 3, Zulu Traveller. This is a three-part series of my autobiography of my life, pretty much up to the age of 30. And this is Durban, Chapter 2, 1977. I'd been talking about issues, problems, because there was Alastair and me living in this little flat by ourselves. It was not a nice area. Our neighbours used to scream at each other and fight, and their babies cried all night. And we felt kind of beleaguered in this little dark, mosquito-ridden area of Durban. Sort of not a nice, I think it's definitely gone to slums now. However, first issue was that I was terribly lonely. The second issue was Alastair became very sickly after joining the daycare centre, and I took him to our friendly GP on the Berea. He had constant tonsillitis, and as a result, I spent almost every Friday afternoon sitting in the waiting room of the surgery to be prescribed yet another course of antibiotics for him. He was pale, had no appetite, and was very thin. It was a constant struggle to get him to eat. After that, it was always a trip to the pharmacy to pick up his prescriptions, administer them, and put him to bed after reading him a story. This was my social life. There was almost no chance I was going to meet anybody, male or female, to be friends with or socialize with. I had a sickly infant and I was thoroughly depressed. It was very kind of my sisters to invite me over as a respite from the lonely flat. But secretly, it upset me. Well, privately, it upset me terribly to see Alastair being pushed around by his slightly older and far more robust cousin, 5 months older than he was, and also a toddler. When he took a toy away from my little baby, as toddlers do at that age, I became disproportionately upset and wanted to cry when I saw the bewildered look on my little boy's face as he stood there empty-handed. I felt he'd lost enough in having his father die and wanted to shield him from any more distress. My sisters couldn't possibly understand the depth of my grief. I hid it as much as I could, and again, the subject of Fred and his death was not to be discussed at all. From the moment we had stepped onto South African soil, my parents had said to me, if anyone asks, and they will, you must tell them that Fred died in a car accident, and that's that. On Sunday, when the Learys, who had initially introduced Fred to me at the July handicap races, came over to have lunch with Mum and Dad, kind and astute Dr. Leary took me aside and said, there's anything you want to talk to me about, ring me and I'll come over. He clearly suspected that there was more to the story about this car accident than met the eye. When people pressed for details, I had to make up something along the lines of narrow Scottish roads in the Highlands and slippery ice. Sorry, this COVID still hasn't left me. Notwithstanding the fact that Fred had died in August, the hottest time of the Scottish summer. I'm so sorry that I never took Dr. Leary up on his offer, because I felt that counselling of any sort would have helped me a little bit. It was eating me up inside as to why Fred had chosen to take his own life rather than live with me and our new baby. I took all the blame for his death on myself and kept running that day over and over in my mind as to what had been my last words to him. Were they kind? Had I told him enough that I loved him? Had he known how deep my love was for him? There was complete silence now from the Mackay-James family. My possessions had finally been sent out, such as they were, mostly my clothes, but not all of our wedding presents, and very little else. Poor Nicola had done her best, but it was clear that nothing belonging personally to Fred had left Glencruitten. The months went by slowly. My job was a distraction. The branch I worked for had a very small staff of 5 people. And that was the reason they did not need a full-time secretary. Inevitably, though, there's always more work than one can fit into a morning. I would have had to stay on to finish it, but always had to go and fetch Alastair. There was nothing that couldn't wait until the next day. If it was particularly urgent, one of the other girls could type a letter. The long, lonely evenings continued to plague me, and so when Diane invited me to a dinner party at her home, telling me to bring Alastair and put him to sleep in one of the spare rooms with her little boy, I jumped at it. Going out alone as a single woman in South Africa was an impossibility. All the bars, even those attached to hotels, were for men only. Places like country clubs and the smarter hotels had a ladies' bar where the women could sit and drink while their husbands drank in the main bar. These were for wives and girlfriends, though, and a single woman would never dream of going to have a drink in a ladies' bar without some kind of female friend. So, unless I went out in a group and I knew nobody there, I couldn't go out at all. There was also the issue of getting a babysitter in for Alastair, unless I dropped him off at one of my sister's homes for their maids to babysit him, as they did for my nephews. Excuse me. I had nowhere or no one to leave him with, and that still brought me to the problem of where I could go on my own. Diane's party consisted of about 20 of her friends and included one of Nicolette's best friends, Mary. She was a lovely woman, very bubbly and great fun at a party, but a very determined social climber. She had never attended St. Anne's College, our very prestigious and most expensive school in South Africa. Her younger brother had been invited as well. He was 2 years older than me and had been to Michael House, the brother school to St. Anne's, the one I'd attended for 6 years. I was introduced to him, a very tall and chatty man with dark hair, and I suspected a bit of a social climber like his sister. Wasn't even remotely good looking, having had trouble with acne in his younger days. I still felt terribly out of place as a young widow, and still found people to be very awkward around me, not knowing what to talk about, and generally skirting around the subject of Fred's death. I was sitting alone on the sofa when the young man came to sit next to me. "I hear you've been through a terrible time," he said, and before I knew it, I was talking openly about Fred and how much I'd loved him and how much I was missing him. He listened sympathetically, which made me feel far more comfortable. We spent the evening in this fashion, with me pouring out some of the grief that had been eating me up inside these past few months. His name was Tom, and he asked me a lot of questions about Fred's inheritance, and was astonished that Alastair had inherited Glencruitten, a massive trust fund, and all the property in Florida, after I had described that clause in Scottish law. At the end of the party, he said, "I'd like to see you again sometime." And I went home feeling a lot better about myself, that finally one person had taken an interest in me and not just skirted around the subject of Fred's death. It was a huge relief. Weeks later, Nicolette had a dinner party with just Mary, her husband, and Tom again, along with myself. Again, it was a very pleasant evening, and this time Tom asked me out that following Saturday. He was working as a bank clerk for Barclays Bank in a small town in Zululand called Mtubatuba, a particularly overcrowded and dreary place just inland from the sea, so it missed the cooling breeze of the ocean and was stiflingly hot and humid. Mtubatuba basically catered for the sugar farming community and those who worked at the sugar refinery nearby at Stanger, as well as a big Indian population. It was a 2 hour drive from Mtubatuba to Durban, and on Saturdays, after his morning shift as a bank clerk, Tom drove down to Durban to fetch Alastair and me. I was a member of the Durban Country Club, which had excellent facilities, including a beautiful swimming pool into which my mother-in-law Bar had dipped into, and changing rooms which she had ignored completely, dropping her tartan outfit on the veranda floor instead and revealing a polka dot bikini. So I suggested we spend the day there. Tom bought himself a swimming costume, drank ice-cold castle lager through the hot afternoons, and I introduced him to Alastair. Tom seemed particularly good with my baby boy, which gladdened my heart, and we had some very pleasant days together. And driving back to Mtubatuba and then returning the next day, we decided that Tom spend the night in my flat with me. He was very interested in my background, highly impressed that I'd been to St. Anne College, the sister school to his. He was also very interested in our farm, the size of it, the number of cattle and sheep it sustained, and pretty much everything about my private life, about my life from a private school to living in a castle in Scotland. This became a pattern. Every Saturday at midday, I'd hear the unmistakable sound of the loose exhaust on Tom's old skodonk come rattling to the entranceway of the flats, and he'd come bounding up the stairs to collect us. Sometimes we went to Mitchell Park, other times to the country club, and now and again we'd take a drive down the south coast to have lunch and a few beers at one of the many beachfront hotels and restaurants down there. Something I began to notice was that anywhere we decided to have a bite to eat, it had to have a liquor license. Tom could not go through one meal without at least 3 castle lagers. Due to the very strict liquor laws in South Africa in the early 1970s, if one wanted an alcoholic drink, one had to have a sit-down lunch somewhere. There was some law which forbade drinking any alcohol at the Durban air terminal unless one ordered a meal. And this also applied to the passenger ship's terminal at the Durban port, where the passengers embarked or disembarked onto the mail ships of the Union Castle line. So we spent many a Saturday afternoon at the Louis Botha airport or the Durban harbour. I saw absolutely no red flags pop up, as Alastair just loved watching the planes take off and land and the big Royal Mail liners come and go. On Mondays, Tom would drive back early in the morning to resume his clerk's job in the bank at Mtubatuba. After 5 weeks, about 5 weeks after we met, Tom asked me to marry him. I was a bit taken aback. For me, it was far too soon after Fred's death, and also, I didn't love him. He persisted, but I stood firm. I'm sorry. I feel we have to wait at least a year after Fred's death. And then there's still the fact that I don't love you. I like you, but I'm still deeply in love with Fred. I held him at bay until a year had gone by, and the first anniversary of Fred's death on the 16th of August came and went. Instead of being put off, Tom now declared that he was head over heels in love with me, wanted to adopt Alastair and treat him as his own son. Mum and Dad hadn't yet met Tom either, although that was not an issue. He'd been to the right school, was a friend of both my sisters, and that would be sufficient for them to crack the nod. The other problem was that I'd had no chance to meet anybody else. Tom had commandeered all my leisure time from the day of our first meeting, and I was still stuck with the problem of not being able to go out on my own to meet anybody else. So, finally, I capitulated. All right, I'll marry you, but on the understanding that I will never love you. I'm still in love with Fred. As callous as it sounded, I had to be absolutely honest with Tom and allow him the option of changing his mind. But no, he agreed instantly and shot off to Maritzburg to ask for his late mother's engagement ring to put on my finger. Mum and Dad met him, and I know that they realized that he was going to be the solution to all problems concerning Alastair and me. My sisters also seemed visibly relieved that I would be no longer languishing on my own in that dreary little flat. I wrote to my parents-in-law, Bar and Bob, Fred's parents, to tell them the news, and they were fairly indifferent about my welfare, but very concerned as to what sort of stepfather Tom would make for Alastair. I reassured them that he had made this promise to me. That's all for today, folks. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's not a very cheerful subject, but things improve. And I want to thank John Moslane very much for being my sound engineer, as I call him. I'm sure there's a better name for it, but he's been so much of a friend to me for the past 4 years. And also to Sean van Vuren for uploading my videos to my YouTube channel. And if you're interested in all my other works, I have 5 books written, all autobiographical, and they're all on my website, www.whitezulubook.com. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye.